Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Deborah Amos, who will be running the show. She is a former colleague of mine at National Public Radio and a dear friend who has covered Iraq extensively for NPR, in addition to many other countries in the Middle East. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and returned to working with NPR after a decade in television news, including stints with ABC's Nightline, World News Tonight, and the PBS program Now. She's also just about to have a book come out, and the name of the book, Deborah, when it comes out in a month's time, you'll find out the title. So let me hand the panel over to Deborah.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this panel on the future of Iraq. And you may think that it's folly to predict the future of a country in 2020 as our panel is billed, but I think that you will hear that our panelists will be a little closer to the present. There's some immediate good news about Iraq. The parliament passed an election law. There's an identity in the country that's emerging that appears to be more secular, more nationalist. The sectarian divide appears to be blurring. The recent bombings, the ones in August and then in October, didn't ignite a sectarian revenge cycle. Of course, the bombers made no distinctions at all between Sunnis and Shiites, and the segregated neighborhoods in the country mourned without reprisals. Ahead of the national elections, Sunni politicians have been courted by powerful Shiites. It's a kind of political speed dating to find willing and acceptable partners to prove nationalist credentials. In some ways, the politicians are running to catch up with the population. There's serious fault lines that I think that our panelists will address. The tensions between Iraq's Arabs and Kurds over not just Kirkuk, but the future of Kurdistan is now considered, certainly by American commanders, as the most serious divide in the country. Transparency International lists Iraq as one of the 3 most corrupt countries in the world. And there's still a serious brain drain as more people want to leave. The earlier mass exodus, some 2 million Iraqis left the country and another 2 million were displaced, has barely been reversed. Relations with the neighbors are more fraught than ever. And I think we have to ask this panel if Iraq's institutions are strong enough to survive after the Americans pull out. We have a great panel to ask these very hard questions. Each is going to speak for 15 minutes, and if I read all of their bios, that would be the entire afternoon. So I'm going to give you a short introduction, and I'm going to start with our first speaker, Michael Corbin, who has enormous street cred in the region. In July of this year, he was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near East Affairs for Iraqi issues, but prior to him coming back to Washington, he was posted and served in Baghdad, in Damascus, and Cairo. Rend Francke has ground truth from Iraq. Not only was she born there, she's just come back from there. She's the executive director and co-founder of the Iraq Foundation, dedicated to promoting democracy and human rights in Iraq. She represented her country in Washington. She was one of Iraq's first ambassadors after the fall of Saddam, and she makes frequent trips to Baghdad, and she's a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Ali Allawi, he's the guy who follows the money. He's a visiting senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government's Carr Center. He's been a minister of trade, a minister of defense, a minister of finance in Iraq, as well as a sharp critic of Washington policy in his book, Winning the War, Losing the Peace. And finally, but certainly not least, James Dobbins. He also follows the numbers. He's the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at Rend. He was the Bush administration's special envoy to Afghanistan, and he raised the flag on the newly reopened U.S. embassy there. He's been a special envoy in Kosovo, Bosnia, Haiti, and Somalia. And Mr. Dobbins was quoted in just about every article critical of truth strength in Iraq in those early days after he published an extensive study on how many troops you actually need to pacify a country. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists, and we will start with you, Ambassador Dobbins.
Thank you. Well, the ultimate test of any effort at post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction is whether you can leave behind a society that's at peace with itself and its neighbors. I think we can debate whether the intervention in Iraq was necessary. I think we can also debate whether or not, on balance, it was beneficial. But I do think there's a reasonable chance that we'll meet that particular test. That is, that we will be able to leave behind a society at peace with itself and its neighbors, although this is by no means assured. Rand published a report a couple of months ago that was mandated by the U.S. Congress, looking at American plans to withdraw from Iraq and critiquing and evaluating them. And Rand, first of all, looked at the sources of the threat to Iraqi stability and concluded that the principal threats did not come from marginal extremists, from al-Qaeda or from elements outside the political system, that in fact the main threats came from elements that are currently in the political system but might withdraw from it under some conditions. And I'll go through some of these threats. The threat that Rand assessed as the most serious, and Deborah's already mentioned this, is not the tensions between Shia and Sunni, but the tensions between Arab and Kurds. And this is most dangerous because these are the factions that are most heavily armed, for one thing, and therefore most capable of actually sustaining a large-scale civil war, and not the kind of irregular civil war that you saw in 2006, 2007, in which only one side had heavy weapons and a capacity to take and hold territory, but in which both sides have that capacity. And in that kind of civil conflict, casualties tend to escalate, refugees tend to escalate. It's a much more violent type of conflict. And so that's the rift that could be most dangerous, most difficult to handle. And it may also be the more likely. A second, of course, is the familiar Shia-Sunni divide. And there is continuing tensions which could again become a source of violence on a large scale. And finally, there's Shia-Shia tensions, that is, between the more extreme factions like those associated with Muqtada al-Assad and those that are more mainstream and more thoroughly integrated into the political system. Now, at the moment, can I have the water, please, Ellie? Now, at the moment, all of these are inside the tent. They're all participating in the political system. And the objective, obviously, should be to keep them in that system, which means, among other things, that they all need to perceive benefits from participating in that system. A study of post-conflict reconstruction shows that the most dangerous period in these kinds of societies is not the run-up to elections. In the run-up to elections, everybody's on their best behavior. They're trying to win votes. It's the aftermath of elections in which the decisions, the power-sharing decisions have been made, and there are inevitably relative losers. And these relative losers are not, there's no tradition of good losers or loyal opposition. And so this is the period of sort of maximum danger. And I think we saw that with the last Iraqi elections, that the greater violence occurred after the elections, not before. So the fact that things are fairly quiet at the moment shouldn't be too much of a source of confidence that they couldn't get worse.